2 days have been set aside in an Ottawa courtroom for a sentence hearing for Freedom Convoy leaders Tamara Leach and Chris Barber. Both were convicted of mischief in April for leading the 3-week protest in the winter of 2022 that crippled downtown Ottawa with hundreds of trucks and thousands of people. The Crown is seeking a 7-year prison sentence for Ms. Leach and 8 years for Mr. Barber, who was also convicted of disobeying a court order by encouraging protest participants to keep honking truck horns. But the potential for long sentences has sparked debate over sentencing overall in Canada. Earlier, I was joined by our contributor, David Clement, to break down the disparity.
David, thank you so much for the time today.
Not a problem.
Now, 7 years for Leach and potentially 8 years for Barber are relatively long. How do these sentences compare to other crimes, and why are some upset about what the Crown is seeking here?
Yeah, so there are a couple of reasons why people are upset about the potentially long sentence. I would say the first category of people who are upset are people who generally supported the convoy from the beginning and kind of view this as political persecution. I think the more serious criticism of the sentencing is the latter, and that is in comparison to some other high-profile crimes and sentences that we've seen lately that leave a lot of Canadians wondering how or why our justice system works the way it does. And so I'll use two very prominent examples. So one was a woman who flew to the Middle East, essentially joined the Islamic State, married an ISIS fighter, participated in terrorist activities, came back to Canada, pled guilty, and then ended up only serving 1 day in prison. Another very prominent example, it's not limited to that, but this is just one that is of note, a gentleman in Alberta who had kind of been a repeat violent offender. He had sprayed a bunch of people with bear spray at one point, was harassing a bunch of people, was arrested, let out on bail. While he was out on bail, he committed a random act of violence and actually murdered a father of 6 kids. And he was given, after pleading guilty to manslaughter, was given 7 years in prison. And so when you kind of map those anecdotal cases out against 7 or 8 years for mischief, right? A lot of Canadians look at this and they say, well, how can someone join a terrorist organization and get 1 day in prison? How can someone randomly murder an innocent civilian and get potentially the same prison sentence as Miss Leach? Something is wrong here in terms of how the justice system is evaluating crimes and sentencing. And no matter how serious you think the convoy is, it certainly had a huge impact in Ottawa and was a huge public nuisance. Whatever you think of that, it's very difficult to justify that disparity.
Well, and I think there are a lot of question marks right now around the criminal justice system. You know, a lot of people are calling Leach and Barber's sentencing very harsh. But the examples that you just listed, did you not think that maybe those were lighter sentences? And the harsh sentence that Barber and Leach are facing should actually just be the baseline. And those examples that you've listed should have been charged with more.
Yeah, and I think the answer to that is probably somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in the middle where I think for anybody watching, I'd be hard pressed to find a Canadian who thinks that 7 years for randomly murdering an innocent Canadian is appropriate, nor would there be many Canadians who think 1 day in prison for joining and participating in a terrorist organization is appropriate. So I certainly think the consensus is that those people were under sentenced. We'll still wait and see what actually happens with the sentencing for the convoy individuals. But I would argue that it's reasonable that it would be substantially less than what is being proposed at 7 and 8 years. So I think really the answer is somewhere in the middle. And it really comes down to the difference between mischief and violent crime. Right? If you murder someone, that is about as violent a crime as you can commit versus something that had a tremendous impact in Ottawa and was a huge public nuisance, but it was exactly that. It was a public nuisance. It was not anything remotely close to murdering an innocent bystander.
And do you think the uproar with this case will go hand in hand with Doug Ford now openly speaking out about the fact that something needs to change with the criminal justice system? Do you think that will support his stance better?
Yeah, I think it does, because the disparity here just highlights how off the mark the sentencing and criminal justice system is. And so as we see more disparities, right, more hypocrisy, if you want to call it that, you're going to see increased calls for Ottawa to do something, whether that's on bail reform or we restructure how we sentence violent criminals. There is going to be a push across the board to change the way we approach the criminal justice system.
And has anyone involved in this case spoken out about the sentencing and what's happening here?
This is one of the most interesting things, because Paul Champ, who was the lawyer in the class action lawsuit on behalf of residents of Ottawa against the convoy, actually said that the sentencing suggestions were ridiculous. And he suggested that Ms. Leach should serve no time and that Chris Barber should serve 6 months. And so here you have the lawyer for the people who were the most impacted by the convoy essentially saying this is a huge overstep if they were to be given the maximum sentences.
And what will be the fallout if they do get a sentence of 7 and 8 years?
Well, I think the fallout is going to be how that is applied to other protests and other criminal acts that are committed at protests. So, I mean, the convoy is not the only protest that has blockaded streets. There are a variety of nuisance-like protests, whether they be environmental, whether they be the pro-Palestine protests we've seen. And the fallout could be setting a really uncomfortable benchmark. Now, none of those protests per se have stretched on for days and weeks and created the same impact, but it could set a precedent to treat those mischief or nuisance crimes a lot heavier. But again, the problem is if you do that, and that is the precedent set there, well, we also have relatively lenient and soft sentencing for violent crimes. It just worsens that disparity problem, and you're going to see more pressure to have a different approach on violent crime.
Now, I already mentioned Doug Ford's stance on the criminal justice system, but politically speaking, how could long sentences spark debate between the Liberals and the Conservatives?
Well, so it's twofold. I think the Liberals, so Pierre Poilievre has spoken out about this now. Several Conservative members of Parliament have spoken out about it, saying that it's ridiculous that they could be sentenced for so long. For the Liberals, they may use that as an opportunity to try and relitigate the convoy and Pierre Poilievre's support for the convoy, which was not particularly popular, especially in the Ottawa area, understandably so. But on the flip side, if they do get long sentences, the Conservatives can use this as a means to attack the Liberals on the sentencing disparity that we're seeing, because it feels like every day there's an example of someone who is either out on bail and committed another crime, or someone who's committed a violent crime and let out on bail. And so the Conservatives could then use that as a political tool to poke at the Liberals and show the need for sentencing reform, which was something that Pierre Poilievre had advocated for in the last election.
Well, David, thank you for breaking that down for us.
Thank you.